Welcome to RCast, the official podcast to the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete, concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. Beyond our platform, our investment partner, Reflective Ventures, funds organizations that are working within our core mission statement to create a better world by enabling social coordination in robust, secure, and scalable ways. I'm Derek Barris, the Director of Content for RChain. Each week on RCast, I'll be talking with the founders of our portfolio companies, as well as co-op members, staff, and other figures in the RChain ecosystem about the most pressing issues in blockchain today. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about the platform, our community, validator sale, and information on becoming a member. Some technologies seem like the next logical step from something else, whereas others often seem like a surprise. Only in retrospect do they make sense. One of the advantages that humans have as a species is our ability to create technologies. Now, we often think of very scientific, science fiction-like futuristic toys as our technologies, but a hammer is a technology. Other animals take pieces of wood or rock and bang things against something else to try to break them open, but there's a certain elegance in a hammer that makes sense. Now, they're so commonplace now that we don't think of it as a technology. Maybe we think of an AI-controlled voice recognition tool that accomplishes the same thing as a hammer does as a technology, and that would be a logical step. On today's RCast, we're going to be applying that idea to cars. So, for example, the idea of a self-driving car, as incredible as it seems, isn't that much of a stretch of the imagination, considering we've been speculating on that for decades, perhaps since as long as cars have been around. But how about a car that can mine cryptocurrency while it's being charged? Well, if we look at it from the perspective of the amount of computing power that's not being used in the car while it's being charged, it makes sense. But the first time I heard that idea, it caught me by surprise. It's not something I associate with the thing that I drive around Los Angeles. Now, if you were to tell me when my phone is sitting here being unused, being charged, could do the same, that would make a little bit more sense. But that's what's happened with our cars. They've become much more like our computers with software that can upgrade the entire system all at once. That is pretty revolutionary, and that is the domain of Tesla, which brings us to Tesloop, one of our portfolio companies, and its founder, Rahul Sanad, who I got to meet with in Los Angeles a couple weeks ago. He lives pretty close to me. I met up with him for coffee with Fabian Al-Sultani, also at RChain. And for about an hour and a half, we sat and he explained the entire business model of Tesloop. I won't get too deep into it because he explains it very well, but it started as a mobility service ferrying passengers from Los Angeles to Las Vegas and back in a Tesla instead of some other shared ride that you could take, and at a rather reasonable price. I don't think he mentions it in the podcast, but it was something like $60 for the trip there. Which compared to a bus or flying or any other way is really relatively inexpensive. But from that model, Rahul and his son, who is the intellectual founder of the company, his idea is what gave birth to it, and his other partners have now created Karmic, CARMIQ.net, is a sort of data sharing protocol that Tesla owners can use to get refunds in certain ways or get paid to share the data that they want to allow to insurance companies, to tire manufacturers. It's really a unique program, and I'll let Rahul explain it in more depth in our talk here. But as someone who isn't particularly interested in cars, I didn't own one for 12 years when I lived in New York City, for example, and I only own one in Los Angeles out of necessity. This was a really eye-opening conversation that we had. It has helped me to change my perspective about how I view driving and cars in general. And I'm very excited about the future and the possible uses of this technology and the types of services that Tesloop and I'm sure other companies are going to be providing that really connects us in new ways. The entire mobility services industry is really fascinating. And without anything further on that, I'll let Raul talk more about Tesloop. Now, when we met, you told me more than anything you're a big fan of Tesla. Why is that?
When we started the business, I would say it was really inspired by, Tesla vehicles, because we really saw them as the first instantiation of something that was truly becoming a digital car, combining deep connectivity where you can both monitor and control the car remotely, along with increasing autonomy and also, the electric drivetrain. So these three things together in a very kind of computerized package to us was incredibly interesting.
And your company has a pretty interesting origin story with your son. I'd love to hear that.
The origin was Hayden, who was 16 about 3 years ago, had just gotten his license. And like maybe common for 16-year-olds, he in March said, "Hey, summer's coming up and I got my license, so I think I should get a car." And, my response was, "That's a great idea. It sounds like you need a job." From there, he was like, "Well, what should I do?" And I'm like, "Figure out something you love. And then, let's try to find something related to that." And he was a big car fan. So he eventually came up with the idea and pitched it to me. He's like, "If you lease me a Tesla, I'll drive people to Vegas and I'll pay for the lease and I'll pay for all the insurance, and you'll have nothing out of your pocket, and I'll drive people to Vegas on weekends, and during the week I'll just kind of tool around town." So that was his idea. My reaction was, wow, that's enterprising, but it feels like you might kill yourself because you barely know how to drive. So from there he suggested that autopilot would solve that problem. And at the time, autopilot had been announced but not yet released. I suggested he ask Elon Musk if autopilot would keep him safe, and if it would, that I would be amenable to leasing him a car for the summer. And so he did that. He bought a share of Tesla stock and went to the shareholders meeting and asked Elon about autopilot. And for the first time, I think any car executive put a real timeline on technical driverless cars. And Elon said, in about 3 years, he thinks that would be possible. So that's really what inspired us to, me and my other co-founders, to join Hayden and switch our focus onto Tesloop.
And you had mentioned you were working on another project. What was that?
Yeah, that was a remote camera app. So the idea was you could get somebody to remotely take a headshot of you on your own phone. We were about a month into it. We kind of had some prototypes working and such, where we'd take over somebody's iPhone and tell them to smile and look to the left and look to the right. That was the project we were on. But just, once we kind of dug into Tesla and the APIs on the cars and everything, we just thought that there was a very big opportunity to leverage the new platform effectively that they were building to really build applications on top of.
And when you launched Tesloop, you started driving people to Vegas. How did that go?
We were very quick. I think that shareholders meeting was beginning of June, and by July 5th, we'd launched the service and we're driving people. We started out with Craigslist ads like Hayden had suggested, and then started doing a little bit of Facebook acquisition and what have you. And the thing that was very gratifying was people just loved the experience. Like, we were getting consistent, ecstatic 5-star reviews from people. Driving the car was amazing. And then in October, like a few months after we started, they released the first version of autopilot. So that then let you automatically steer the car. And it was, I think a real milestone that you could buy a car that would steer itself to Vegas at that point.
And you have a lot of miles on your vehicles, correct?
Yeah. So that first car that we started with was a Tesla Model S 85D, and that has now about 430,000 miles on it.
And it's still in great shape.
Yeah, it's in really good shape. People get in it and they feel it's kind of new. It's got some very, minor wear and tear as you might expect. But for being in service 3 years with people in and out of it every day, it's in remarkably good condition, like better than a lot of rental cars I get.
So as someone who is not particularly a car person, I didn't own one for 12 years when I lived in New York, and I have one out here in Los Angeles out of necessity. I had mentioned to you that my wife had a first generation Nissan Leaf that didn't go so well. So what is Tesla doing what have they dialed in to make it so effective and valued?
I think if you look at the hardware, clearly they are creating something that is, has durability beyond what any other car might have today. And that's durability, meaning it'll last 400,000 plus miles with very little maintenance. So, I think we're probably up to about $20,000 total maintenance on that car. But if it were a typical gas car, it would have had probably, 80 oil changes every year and, tune-ups and maybe gasket issues or transmission issues or something like that. So the fact that those cars and we have cars that have over 300,000 miles that are still in their original batteries. There's some degradation, but it's not to the point where it's a problem at all. I mean, that's really, from a quality perspective, I think pretty impressive. And then beyond that, I think the whole idea to me of upgradable software, I still don't think you see in any other car the way you do in Tesla, where they, just upgrade the whole thing, self-driving firmware, everything, and they can do that at any time. And so far as I've heard, nobody's ever had severe problems with that or anything. A few have aborted, but it just goes back to its initial state. So that upgradability, I think, is kind of the ante for being kind of a modern car now, yet we haven't seen that copied. And it's been now, 5 years since that came out in the Model S. And then, the autonomy is getting increasingly good, with a big release just in the last few weeks here. And if you listen to what, they're saying at Tesla, the curve on that is about to, slope back up. They'd had about a year of, I would say, sideways movement where they replaced their software and hardware configuration and everything. So, when we first started, we didn't have it. Then it improved very rapidly, like over the next year and a half, and then kind of not too much happened. And I think now we're back on track. So it's all of those things together that really, I think, in one package, make it, completely different. And then for us, the really big idea here is that we can constantly monitor the cars and we know where they are and how fast they're going and, are the doors open, are the doors closed, and we can unlock the doors and, set maximum speeds when we're renting them to people. So this is really something very different than you can do with any other car, out of the factory, kind of without any modifications, without any hardware, for any car anywhere in the world.
I had a issue for a while being a movement instructor as well, and people's attentional faculties just degrading more and more. So for a while I resisted the idea of self-driving cars, but now seeing the fact that people, if anything that will make the roads safer is going to be better, and if that means that people are giving up their sense of agency while on the road, but in a safer situation, I might think overall that's a better move for the safety of other people. How far away do you see us from being, as a society, from most people having very little to do with driving while they're in their cars?
I think that is a long way off, like 10 years. And the reason is, maybe even a little bit more than that, but the reason is that there's so many cars and it takes so long to replace them. So it's about a 20-year cycle to get, all new cars. Hayden now is, in fact, I think still driving a 1998 Lexus or something. So that's older than he is. And, if the metric is most people, not driving, let's say it's 50% penetration in 12 years or something. For most new cars being something where if you aren't driving, if you take your hands off the wheel, if you start texting, maybe legally or illegally, the car can take care of that. I mean, Tesla feels that by the end of next year, that's possible. And I think certainly in 2020, that's very likely. So for certain cars, which will still be relatively low numbers, but I think you'll see that. And if you can buy that feature in a car that costs $40,000 or $50,000, I think that really changes things, especially if that car can last 3 times longer than, any other car. It means the actual price is very, reasonable.
Well, even I have a 2018 Subaru Forester, and there are functions like automatic braking in there now, and it takes me by surprise because sometimes I'm pretty aware and I don't text and drive, so I'm aware of my surroundings, but even then sometimes it hits on me, and there's a steep learning curve here for some people, but overall I think it will be a net positive.
Yeah, I think there is a interesting learning curve, and I think at best you don't need to learn anything, and the car just passively or actively just does what it needs to do, like brake when you are about to hit somebody. Now, the interesting thing about the Teslas versus the Subaru, in 5 years, I assume your Subaru is still behaving the same way it does now, where in 5 years, a Tesla you buy today can, be completely reprogrammed and can use data from other cars that, things that have been learned and what have you. And the, user experience around that now, turning autopilot on is a user triggered. The driver needs to trigger that. But I believe that in a few years, car makers may choose to do it the other way around, where by default you're in kind of this autopilot mode. And it's interesting because I don't know if you've driven the Teslas on autopilot, but it's a little bit like if you ever recall going to like Disneyland, where like you've got a car and it's on this track and you can steer a little bit, but you can't get it off, past the rail. So what the Tesla model is effectively they build a digital set of like bumper rails that you can kind of bump around within and steer. But then if you kind of torque the steering wheel hard, you can then get outside of those. So it's a really interesting kind of, human machine interface that I think will work well for, people, even if they're not super familiar with it. So you can kind of be driving around a little bit and it'll keep you safe, but give you some latitude, and just take care of things automatically. That would be the ideal scenario that I think they're headed for.
I also am a fan of it. I have not driven an autopilot yet, but I will say when the new model comes out next year, the lower price level is comparable to what I pay for a Subaru. So at that point, you have to look into it, and the fact that you do have software upgrades available. I mean, it's acting more like a phone at this point rather than what we're accustomed to as a car, which in the bigger picture sense makes sense. Now, your business model, the Los Angeles to Vegas, that seems like it was just the first phase of the rollout, but you have a really interesting model moving forward for any Tesla owner, and I'd like to hear more about that.
So in the context of running our own fleet, which, was 1 car first and then 3 and then 8, and then we had a few people give us their vehicles, so it expanded a little more from there. We developed software that would talk to all the cars, like every, up to 4 times a second, and query data from them. And we had I think the first fleet API agreement with Tesla that would, let us kind of get all the data streamed out of the cars. And we then started to realize that, wow, this data can actually be used to make our operational challenges much easier. So, for example, we were working with Goodyear on tire service, where they would monitor the pressure of the tires And then they would also look at the odometer readings that would come from, the vehicle through our system, and that would tell them when the car needed service. So, does the tire need to be rotated? Does the tire need to be changed? Is there, low pressure that needs to be addressed? And they actually deployed a mobile truck to do that. So it would kind of figure out where the car is and go and find it and take care of it. And that really changed the game on our maintenance, where instead of taking the car out of service for half a day to do some maintenance because we had to go somewhere and wait and get it, fixed, and then we'd kind of miss the early loop, so we'd have to wait till the late loop. Doing it while the car was charging in between loops, was a huge efficiency. And then we also started sharing data with our insurance company, Farmers. And, now we could tell them, hey, we're never going to go more than 80 miles an hour. But I think once you can actually share the data that shows all the cars are actually not doing that, because we can limit the speed. And even if we're renting out a car, it just technically won't go any faster. That really changes your risk profile and liability. So, the idea of sharing data, sharing the tire pressure, sharing the fact that the tires have been maintained with your insurance company, sharing the speed, clearly creates better economics. From there, we said, hey, this is really useful for us, but what if we open this up to every Tesla owner in the world? And we could then also expand the range of features that could be offered through the platform. So right now, when you buy a Tesla, you probably get some best practices for battery charging, like don't fully charge it. And if you do fully charge it a lot, you need to let it rest for a little bit and reset itself. And people kind of follow those, but it's a little bit complicated and it's a little hard to follow. And most people are not heavily tracking their battery charging situation and everything. So on a platform like this, you could monitor the battery charging behavior and suggest to people, better practices. So if you're fully charging, but you're never fully running out, that's not something you need to be doing. So, our feeling is that connecting any car really makes a ton of sense and lets you start creating all sorts of features that are better for car owners, whether they be battery advice or tire service from a third party or usage-based insurance quotes. We feel that, we're about to go through what maybe the personal computer did in the very early 90s, where in maybe 1990, you bought a personal computer and it was an island and you were doing Lotus 1, 2, 3 and, there was no network. But by 95, everybody was connected to their LAN or to AOL or to the internet. And the idea of not being connected then seemed, kind of quaint. Now we think, you get a connected car, but all you're typically doing with the connectivity is maybe you're unlocking it remotely, checking the door state, checking the battery state, but it's not really connected to a network that's adding constant value. So we believe with our new product that we call Karmic, this is the first step to providing that type of value, where any Tesla owner can go to karmic.net and in 90 seconds they can sign up, enable us to pull their data feed. And, our attitude on it, I think, is very kind of blockchain inspired, where, we want to be a service for owners to use their connectivity on their behalf. We don't want to be kind of a service that takes ownership of their data and, sells them off to advertisers or something like that. But, we're releasing features that we think over the next few months will create increasing value for any car owner that connects to us.
And you had also mentioned the amount of computing power in each Tesla, something like currently 200 MacBooks.
Yeah.
Was that correct?
Yeah.
And that's going to keep increasing. And you had ideas about being able to utilize that when the driver isn't driving.
Yeah. Well, I think just conceptually, if you're looking at an autonomous vehicle, like right now, I think the Teslas have something like 200 MacBooks worth of processing power, and that's with an NVIDIA PX Drive 2 chip. But Tesla is creating their own silicon that should be in cars by maybe April or May of next year. And that is a kind of order of magnitude more processing power. In that case, it's kind of a dedicated matrix multiplication type of chip. But in general, with an electric car, you need to be charging probably at least a quarter of the time. You're always going to have at least a quarter of the cars sitting around with, maybe thousands of MacBooks worth of processing power. Now, it's a little different. They're not CPUs. They're, dedicated chips. But conceptually, you could use these, for some other purpose while they're sitting. And often while they're sitting, they may be connected to low-cost electricity. So this, I think, for Tesla, it's not an open platform, so you can't really use the processing power for other things. But I think as you see other car makers release autonomous cars, some of them will clearly, I think, experiment with opening the platform and letting you do something with that. And, conceivably that could, be used in a variety of ways and kind of for decentralized processing, either kind of in a blockchain mining style or, for dedicated network activities or just for any other random things for SETI searching for aliens or what have you.
And you also mentioned, rightfully so, that there are some applications of your business that are applicable to blockchain and others that aren't. But what are some of the uses of blockchain specifically besides potentially mining with the cars that are at rest or being charged? What else do you see your company using blockchain for?
So the mining with cars, I think that's a ways down the path, so it won't be one of the first. I think the really logical thing you want to do with the blockchain is to keep a receipt of all your car data. And you want one that you can kind of trust. So when somebody says they changed your tires or fixed your brakes or something like that, that you know it's true. So if you look at what Carfax does, it provides a fair amount of value, but it's pretty simple. If you look at the state of a connected car now, you're generating data every second, dozens of data points. You could supplement that with all the service records and keep basically a database log of everything the car's done and everything that's happened to it. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Like your state of the art now is when you sell your car, somebody's like, hey, do you have any service receipts? And you open up your glove compartment and you pull out a bunch of papers and you hand it over and they're like, oh, good. Now they can look through those. And I think that can all become digitized. And fundamentally, we think every connected car should have a backend database that stores all that and tracks it. Because now when you have a connected car, be it a GM or a Tesla or whatever, the car company is probably storing a lot of that data, but you actually don't have access to that. You can query it in, real time, and at any given time, you can find out where it is and how fast it's moving and what have you. But once, if you don't do that, then you lose that information. Our feeling is we can take all the car data, we can store it in a centralized database. And, if you run the numbers, storing that data, just not the sensor data for autonomy, but just the basic telemetry is probably about, a handful of gigs each year. So it's, 10, 20, 30 cents a year storage on Amazon. Whereas storing that on Ethereum would be like $50,000 a year. So clearly, right now, you don't want to store all that data on the blockchain. But I think once we get to the point where, especially the data is signed from the cars and service records, and somebody, changes your tires or brakes and, signs that they've done it, you want to store those events in a manner that, is fairly tamper-proof. So we think that car history logging is a great use case. And to start out with, that'll really just be probably, taking a hash or some, large set of data and just proving that, oh, this hasn't been changed. You'll still need the centralized source to get the data. But once you have that, you can show that it hasn't been altered after the fact. So, in general, car history logging we think is very low cost and very useful. And car history logging on the blockchain gives you, a little additional assurances that, that data hasn't been changed after the fact.
Right. I was just reading about how companies are working on solving the medical record problem as well. How, when I switched insurance recently from Blue Cross to Kaiser, the process of getting all my records over, it seems like we should be past these things at this point. Even getting a receipt in a store, it seems antiquated now. Like everything should be going there, but we're slowly getting there. I am interested in knowing, I know you've talked to Tesla a little bit. How have they responded to what you're doing?
I mean, I think in general, they've always been very supportive and favorable. I mean, I think the benefit we bring to them is acquainting a lot of people with their vehicles. Like we were putting 2,000 people a month, 60% had never been in a Tesla before in Southern California. So that I think it's, a mobility service is a great way to sell luxury cars. Like I think it's the most efficient way to get people in the car, because instead of, paying for them to come and test drive and talk to people and what have you, they pay you. And instead of being in the car for 15 minutes, they're in the car for 2 or 3 hours if you're doing long distance mobility. So I think that was very beneficial for everybody. And, now we hope that we can really step that up, because previously it was just in Southern California. But we feel if we can, start adding features to help people treat their batteries better, to help them fill out their tax forms for state or, federal tax rebates, or for getting California HOV stickers, or, for helping them share their cars with other people, which many people do on Turo today, but it's very complicated and very labor intensive. We think we can make that, much simpler, where instead of taking 3 hours to set up, we think it should take 3 minutes. And instead of, having to go and meet people and do customer service and everything, that can be automated, remotely administered, and done by other people if you're busy working while your car is being rented out. So we think there's a lot of benefit to connected car owners that we can bring to the table, and as such, I think any car maker will benefit from that, because it makes the ownership experience of their vehicles more pleasant and more economically favorable in the case of car sharing, and in many cases safer. If we can, monitor pressure and seatbelts while your teenager's in the car and make sure everybody's buckled up, that could be a big win that saves lives.